I'm Jennifer Keltner here at the American Patchwork and Quilting Sewing Lab with Angela Walter, Handy Quilter's ambassador for machine quilting. We're talking about specialty fabrics. You'll find lots of fun and different fabrics beyond quilting cottons at your local quilting store. But how do you sew with them, and more importantly, how do you machine quilt with them? T-shirt quilts are probably one of the most common specialty fabrics that people work with, but there are plenty of others to choose from too. What have you got to show us, Angela?
Absolutely. Well, I quilt for customers as well, and I find that my customers are pretty adventurous when it comes to picking out the different kinds of fabrics. And so over the years, I've picked up a couple of tips or tricks to work with those kind of fabrics, especially for machine quilting purposes.
Terrific.
The first one I brought along is a linen. It seems that this is getting more and more popular as time goes on for quilting, and no wonder. I mean, it quilts up gorgeous.
The texture is awesome.
Beautiful. The only thing that you're going to struggle with is if you notice it's a woven fabric. So it's pretty loose, has a loose weave, which will mean when you're quilting, it can really kind of suck in. So you want to make sure that you're basting the edges of your quilt before you actually start filling that in. And that's really the only tip I would have for it. It quilts beautifully using the same needle and thread that you're probably already using.
So really it's just the raveling of the edge. You have to be careful not to get too close to that or it'll pull out.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. Another one that's kind of more and more popular is the voile or the voile.
Right, either way, they're both correct, voile or voile. What I love about this fabric is the hand of it. It's so, so soft. And on this quilt that we had run in one of our publications, you've got it on the front and the back of the quilt, but I know some quilters also like to use it just for the back of the quilt to give it a little bit cooler feel, a little bit lighter weight. What suggestions do you have for working with voile?
Well, you know, if you're using it on the front and the back, then I would suggest a thinner batting so that you kind of retain that kind of coziness of the fabric or the nice cuddleness. I don't know
Great
if that's
drape.
There
Right.
you go, drape. That's probably the technical term for it. I would maybe consider using a needle that's a little bit sharper. Since it has that little bit tighter weave, it'll kind of go through there a little bit better. But usually it's a pretty easy fabric to mess with and to deal with. I would just suggest the thinner batting so that you don't lose those characteristics.
And if you're putting it just on the back of your quilt, would you suggest just keeping everything else the same as far as needle and thread?
Yeah, I just quilted a quilt just like that I had that on the back and the front, and it was no problem at all.
Great.
Another fabric that seems to get a lot of use is the plush type fabrics. And I mean,
Very
when you
popular.
quilt them up, they are just so cuddly.
Right.
There's really not a whole lot to change with this when it comes to needle or thread, but where you're really going to want to make sure that you take care is when it comes to loading.
Right.
The actual fabric itself, like most fabrics, has a selvage. So there's one part of the fabric that won't stretch as much as the other. You see here it gives you a lot more stretch.
Right.
So if you're going to load this on your machine, especially if it's for a backing, try to pin it along the stretchy side. That way you won't pull it too tight. Because when you start quilting it, if you pull this too tight, you take it off the machine, it's going to kind of curl up on itself. And I did that one time to a baby quilt, and it was devastating because I felt like I spent so much time just
Ends up looking like a turtle shell.
Exactly. You'll never get it flat again. So if you can just be mindful not to stretch it too tight, especially if you're using it on the front and back, you don't really have to worry about changing thread or needle there either.
And I think that's the trick for quilters is that we're not used to usually working with stretchy fabrics. So there's something different about working with them that makes us a little bit leery, but you really don't need to be. And this quilt is one that ran in our publication. It's got that great plush back, and you can see the texture created by the quilting, which I really like. But it's sort of got the 1-2 punch in that on the right side of the quilt, it's a t-shirt quilt as well. So I know you've got some tips to share with us about t-shirt quilts and what to work with, but even combining them like this brings its own set of issues as well.
Yes, yes. Well, I brought a piece of jersey, and we all know that the problem with t-shirt quilts is they're nice and stretchy. I mean, you get a stretch to that, and so if you put that on your machine and you stretch it too much, you're really going to mess up the integrity of the fabric. So you want to make sure that you don't stretch it and that you go pretty slow with the quilting, because what will happen is it'll kind of move on itself, and you'll get those tucks that won't look so good.
And a common mistake I think people make is we learn to interface these fabrics, but sometimes people will use a really heavy interfacing for it, or you'll have places on a t-shirt or jersey where there's a lot of painting or screening on the shirt that makes it hard to needle.
Absolutely. I would be very cautious and very slow when quilting with that interfacing. You want to make sure that you're giving your needle time to complete the stitch. There's 2 layers that it's going through at that point, so you'll kind of run into thread breakage. So anytime heavy interfacing, and if you have like a painted part of your t-shirt, you probably just want to steer clear from that altogether, because the heat from the needle will actually transfer that paint. So when it comes to t-shirt quilts, slowing it down, making the quilting nice and big and kind of more flowy. There's not a whole lot of custom tight quilting on those because you don't want to have it, get those
Right.
tucks and stuff.
And the heat you're talking about is really the friction caused by the needle making several penetrations in the quilt top itself.
Yes.
So whether you're working on a long arm machine or working on a sit-down sewing machine, that friction that's created is the same. And I always think that you can sort of feel it as the machine is trying to make that stitch. If you start feeling it drag, you know you need to slow down. We've talked at different times about, loving the need for speed as you're quilting, but when you're working with specialty fabrics, it really is a time that you might want to slow down, take your time. You can quilt through any fabric. It's just a matter of having patience. So thanks for sharing these tips for working with specialty fabrics. And no matter what your favorite fabric is, whether it's quilting cotton or voile, t-shirt knits, plush fabrics, linens, any of those, you can quilt through it. Just take your time and enjoy the process.